Welcome back. All right. So I talked last time about fear, and I used the episode of Midnight from Doctor Who to talk about what happens in groups and how contagious fear can be. Tonight, I'm going to use another Doctor Who episode, but this time I'm going to kind of pull from a couple of episodes that have a recurring theme. What happens when we identify a threat that presents a lot of unknown risks to our safety and to our well-being? Specifically, what I want us to kind of pay attention to, particularly from a therapy aspect as well as from a knowing place inside of the human body that recognizes on a gut level something is not just quite right. Now, I'm going to make reference here to my mom, who is in stage 6 of dementia. And I've noticed that there's kind of a paranoia that follows her. The interesting thing about this paranoia, and when I ask her about it, she's adamant that what she's experiencing is real, that she is feeling something that is rooted in something tangible, but she can't quite identify it. And that's why I think I was prompted more so to do this second piece around this particular topic. Sometimes we can look at something and recognize there's something about it that just upsets us. Perhaps it even just stirs something and we can't quite put a name to it. We don't really have a way to describe it or to give it really any more meaning other than the fact that we feel something around it that's unsettling. And I guess that's maybe the best way that I can describe it. So going back to my mom's experience, so you notice the window behind me. That would drive my mother nuts because in her world, she's anticipating somebody is outside looking at us. They're watching us, waiting for us to go to sleep so that they can come in and do something very nefarious. What? She doesn't know, but that's how she sees her world. Now, here's the second part of this. In the Sally Sparrow episode, when the Weeping Angels show up, Sally Sparrow and her friend are going to an abandoned house. This is an interesting theme that I see throughout my therapy practice. And it starts very early on with young children. And it made me think of my own experience with Sir Graves Ghastly. This was a guy out of Detroit who on Saturdays, he hosted horror movies on regular television. There was something about closing all of the shades and blinds in the house and watching something scary because you could control that fear and be excited by it. Now, this goes back to something that I've talked about before, that if you've seen the documentary that I contributed to, Severed Conscience, over on Rumble, we have a tendency to want to control things that are within our sphere of control. And the interesting thing is, in my therapy room, I talk to clients who come in with I guess the best way to describe it, they're calling it anxiety. I suspect that there's something else going on because when I start to probe this and ask, what does that mean to you? It doesn't always mean anxious. Often what it means is there is something that is unknowable that is unsettling. And I know you heard me say that about 5 or 6 times now. That's because we don't really know how to put into language or how to capture exactly what's happening, but we know that there is something out there that is causing our senses to be on alert. And if you recall what I talked about before in that first episode was the fact that often our brain is experiencing something. Now, science likes to tell us that we're misfiring, that there's something happening where there's a miscue and we're misreading those cues, or if our higher functioning brain keeps thinking about something and accessing an ancient memory or connecting it incorrectly to something that happened and trying to give us a different outcome. Often clients talk to me about their what if. They'll start to, as they call it, overthink. Here's my take on overthink. This is not from a psychological standpoint. This is from really more observation, because as a patrol officer, people would tell me that they were second guessing themselves, or they would tell me that they thought something had happened. And truth be told, I don't know that it's really possible to overthink. I do think what happens, and maybe science does a better job of explaining this someplace other than in the periodicals and journals that I've seen, And if they have, by all means, please share those down below for the edification of the others. There's something that happens that invites us to a state of perceiving something that maybe is just outside of our awareness, our conscious awareness. And in that, we begin to frame a narrative around it, and we begin to catastrophize, or we begin to think in a particular direction about whatever that threat may be, which is why the episode of the Weeping Angels, particularly with Sally Sparrow, is so good, because she's going not really expecting to find something, and then she does. But the thing is, in the moment, it's an innocuous thing that she sees every day, and it doesn't present that immediacy of threat that we would think that it does. Now, you might be asking yourself, all right, Kelly, so where are you going with all of this? What does any of this have to do with anything, and why is this on a therapy channel? Well, a couple of reasons. Because, first of all, we live in a society where we have access at our fingertips to virtually every library in the world. We have all kinds of information, more than we could ever possibly consume. Supposed to make our lives easier. In fact, a lot of the things that we have in front of us are supposed to make our lives so easy, and we're supposed to be so much more fulfilled. We're supposed to have so much more free time, but we don't. Now, from a more archaic standpoint, we understand what this is really all about, because in the 1950s, there were philosophers. Not to mention, even as far back as the 3rd century, there were philosophers that were talking about this very thing. If we become too adept at a life of ease and leisure, there's a boredom. And in that boredom, we begin to question things. So I think this is a brilliant vehicle looking at the Sally Sparrow episode, principally because the Weeping Angels present this kind of threat that they're moving when you're not looking at them. So you can see how something innocuous, something that we pass by all the time and never give it a second thought. But if you think about it in the terms of what I just described, that existential threat, that something that just niggles at us, that causes us to begin to spiral into a downward devolution of thinking, that's where this is coming from. So here's a case in point. I think I mentioned about my difficulty with roller coasters. I can recall my friend Lindsay and I were standing in line down at Cedar Point, and the more that I thought about the fear of getting on the roller coaster, I'd already been shot at a few times as a police officer. You would think this would be no big deal. The fact is, it was horrifying to me to think about getting on that roller coaster going upside down. And to this point in my life, this far back from it, I don't really recall what I was specifically thinking or how I devolved. I just know that the more that I looked at it, the more I grew pale, the more that my body began to shake, and the more that I had this significant unsettling inside of my body. That's the only thing that I really remember about it. And Lindsay's saying something to the effect that, get out of line, Kelly. That was it. Get out of line. I did. Eventually, though, I confronted that fear and I got on roller coasters and found that I really enjoyed them. It took me shifting, making a conscious choice to take an action toward the thing that I was most afraid of, for me to conquer that. And then what I did over a period of 3 days, I continually faced that challenge. Now, I was fortunate because I went to work for SeaWorld and I got an opportunity to get on those roller coasters as an employee. Didn't have to wait for lines because it was before the park opened and they have to run those anyway. So the interesting thing about this is, and I'm going to bring this back around to what I said before, the reason that this episode is really a good illustration of existential threat and what happens to clients before they come to see me in therapy is there's often a history of events that underscore how they're arriving at my anxiety. Now, the frustration that I, as a provider, have is when people own that. And I'm sure that you're sitting there thinking, okay, and? Well, here's the thing. The unconscious mind, or as certain scientists like to refer to it, that part of our brain that is outside of our awareness, that does think and stores memories and holds on to fear and throws those fear messages forward, those self-preservation messages, is also paying attention to what you're saying. And so when you're telling yourself, this is mine, it thinks naturally it's a part of self. And so why does it want to get rid of a part of self? That'd be like saying, I'm going to cut off my finger because, well, it got in my way today and I really don't need it for anything. So, chuck that baby to the curb because, I got 3 more on this hand. I know I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek about that, but the truth of the matter is the unconscious mind, as I'm going to refer to it, really does hold on to things that it feels like are an intrinsic part of self. And when I'm using it in that context, what I'm really saying is we like to think of ourselves as being a whole entity, and that includes the corporeal part, which is the body, as well as what we think of is ourself in our mind. Now, just as a slight digression and rabbit trail, I was living in San Diego, and I got up one morning and I went to get dressed, and I'm standing in front of the mirror, and it was the first time I'd really looked at myself in a full-length mirror in probably 3 or 4 years. And I stood there and I was kind of taken aback. I hadn't really looked at myself in that 3 or 4 years transitioning from South Dakota to San Diego and really paid attention to what my body looked like from the neck down, because I was spending so much time here. It never occurred to me to stop to think about what do I look like when I present to the world. Here's the other funny thing. Science will also show you that we often can't recognize ourselves from the back. Now, the interesting thing is there's a photograph of me that the Rapid City newspaper took after another officer and I responded to the courthouse for a disturbance. And I'm walking the female, and my partner is walking the male from that disturbance over to the jail from the courthouse. And I looked at the back of me and I thought, holy crap. So, we get really self-judgmental too. But I say that as a digression, and if you get an opportunity to look that up, it's kind of entertaining. I don't recommend it. All right, so back to the angels, the weeping angels. Now, the interesting premise of this story is that Sally Sparrow ends up going to this abandoned house. Now, when she gets there, she finds her name and she finds some other writing that indicates to her that somebody knows that she's there, even though she hadn't been there before. She has a girlfriend that goes with her, and that girlfriend disappears because the angels take your future. And I think this is a brilliant premise because it invites us to think in a number of different ways. One, about time. 2, about the essence of who we are and our possibilities about the future. Which ties me back to why sometimes people find it really hard to think about the future without feeling something happening inside of them that is unsettling. Yep, I went back to unsettling again. That might be my word for today. In that unsettling, there's a difficulty with not knowing what the future is, wanting to control for outcome, wanting to be able to arrest and master whatever's going to come, kind of from a place of knowing, but also from a place of anticipating all of the ways that it could possibly go wrong, all of the ways that a person could possibly be embarrassed, all of the ways that a person could be confronted for potential rejection. Now, that's an awful lot. So to sum it, how am I not enough? And, frankly, when I sit with a lot of clients around the types of behaviors I just described, where they're constantly thinking and they're constantly self-critical, constantly working on that message about self. Now, you heard me talk about seeing me from the back. I was very self-critical of that photograph when I saw it. I now keep it on my desk in my bedroom so that I see it every day. Now, I've kind of become desensitized to it. And the interesting thing about that is every now and then I will look up at it and it will catch my attention. And the reason that it catches my attention is probably because there are 2 things that are happening in that photograph. One is because there is that key memory that says I recall that event. But the other thing that I notice is the back of me strikes me. And I think it strikes me simply because of the awareness of the unfamiliarity of being able to see myself from the back. Now, when I was an umpire, people would take pictures of games. I wouldn't even realize that it was me that was behind the plate that they were taking the photograph of. The same thing was true when I played softball. A lot of the time, I had a hard time picking me out of the photographs unless it was a face on, principally for that same reason. But if I underscore that and I bring that back to our image of self. Now, the interesting thing about the image of self is that on a number of fronts, what's happening is that we have a tendency to look at ourselves through a very critical lens. Now, I'm going to tie this back to Sir Ghastly, or Sir Ghostly Graves, whatever his name was, Sir Graves Ghastly, I think that was his name. In those contexts, when kids are reading scary novels, when kids are watching videos or movies of scary events, there's this base knowledge that says, I know that I am safe because, and it usually has something to do with the fact that I'm in a room that I know, I control the environment, and I can turn the TV off. I recall that when I lived in Marshall, one of my neighbors, she and I would talk to each other while we were watching Ghost Whisperer, and then there was a Ghost Chasers episode that was on right after that. And she and I would talk through that. I was living in a house that was built in the middle 1800s and had been a speakeasy before the turn of the century, right up until about the 1920s. So, you would think if there was something there, that would be an ideal place for it. But the thing is, because of the location, because of my sense in that house, I was very familiar with the house, and I felt very grounded in the house, felt very safe in the house, never really felt any kind of threat in the house. And that was all while I was working as a police officer in Battle Creek. So the brilliance of that was that, again, I was controlling the amount of fear that I was allowing in and the excitement of participating. So now going back to, obviously, the episode of Midnight and the episode with the Weeping Angels. Sally's character and her friend are knowingly and kind of unknowingly attempting to approach something that is potentially very fear-provoking, but also creates that sense of excitement. And so I think you can see how, on the one hand, it's kind of delectable. On the other hand, there's something really very, I almost said it, there's something that causes that stirring in us that says my senses are alert, and there's a tingling, there's kind of an anticipation about something. So while we're monitoring that, we're having a couple of different experiences. Now, what shows up in my therapy room, though, is people that are trying to wrestle with the fact that they never get to the exciting part. It always seems to be something that is centered around a dread. I once worked with a woman who, during the lockdowns, refused to go outside. In fact, she refused to be in much of the house with her family. Now, it was a big banner day when we went from inside the house to the mailbox and then back again, despite the fact that nobody was home. But you can imagine how we begin to talk to ourselves and the messages that we're taking in and how we're hearing those things. We begin to become very inured inside of an experience, and then we begin to change our reality because we begin to accept that there's a certain level of this that is so overwhelming and so outside of our control. Well, that's why there's a couple of things about the episode that I think are off track, but there are a number of things on this that are very much in keeping with what we're talking about, which is, what is that sensation? Now, most people point to their chest. Many people point to their head when I ask them, where do you feel this? This is a somatic theory that says that the body retains a lot of this information because the body is constantly trying to deal with whatever is going on. So increased adrenaline, increased cortisol, the inflaming of the muscles, drawing the blood in closer to the body to protect the vital organs. The brain is constantly mediating and working through this in an effort to try to create a sense of safety and control. This is where we get the idea of fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I'm coming around to the idea as a provider that there are a lot of people who get stuck in freeze and fawn. And they can still function. It's just that it's really hard to break those chains of that sensation. And so this is where I think the episode really helps us to kind of break some of those things down in a little bit more knowable fashion so that we can begin to kind of start to look at this from a more therapeutic standpoint. Because ultimately what I want to do is I want to invite us to the ability to recognize vehicles for change, where we can implement that change and improve self and improve the quality of experiences. But we can also maybe let go of the freeze, let go of the fawn, because it served its function, and we're ready to move on to whatever the next thing is. So let me go back to the episode. Sally and her friend go into this abandoned house, and like I said, she begins to uncover information that looks like somebody knew that she was coming. And again, she's still trying to kind of wrap her head around, how would anybody know that I'm coming here? The interesting thing is, you can see that there's kind of a heightened arousal. There's a sense of something really bad is about to happen and I need to be prepared. So pay attention to that. And when we're looking at this, even the sound of her voice changes when she begins to realize maybe something more ominous is occurring. And again, that takes her into that hyperarousal. Now, here's the interesting thing about hyperarousal. A number of physiological changes happen to us, and they're often outside of our awareness. And unless you've seen camera footage of yourself in that kind of a situation, most of the time we don't even recognize it until somebody points it out to us. Now, having seen enough people when I was a patrol officer who were in the grips of fear and who were struggling with that sensation of freeze or fawn, because most of the ones that would take flight, I was in foot pursuit. Most of the ones that wanted to fight, we were in a dog pile. So you kind of could see those coming too. But let me go back to the part about the freeze. You know, the natural inclination is if I stand stock still, it'll go around me, it'll ignore me, it won't notice me, and there's a passivity there. But there's also an even higher degree of changes in the body chemistry in order to preserve the body. One of my favorite things when I used to take kids backpacking is, I had an old timer who said, tell the kids to lay down on the ground and play dead. No. Because the thing is, you're still vulnerable. You want to make yourself as big as possible so that you look more threatening than the thing coming at you. But see, that seems counterintuitive to us. It's like when I used the metaphor a couple of videos ago, about getting caught in a hydraulic. We're already panicking. The thing is, to have the ability to think, to make ourselves wide in order to spit us out of the hydraulic, often we just don't have it in that moment when we're confronted with whatever that challenge is. And that is why it becomes so important for us to work on things outside of the therapy room as well as inside the therapy room, but also to work on those things in moments when there's calm. And, I'm going to invite people to come to this video. And if you're one of my clients, I hope that, this makes sense for you and you understand why I referred you here. Because I want you to understand, first of all, from a knowing place, where that comes from. When we're feeling that here, often what is happening is our breathing goes up into here. So now we're breathing up into our chest. Second thing that happens is our eyes widen because we're trying to take in a wider field of view so that we can see more of the threat and anticipate that. We may also notice that there's tingling sensation. You may notice that your hands get cold and clammy. That's the body's way of pulling all of that blood flow back around the vital organs to protect it. And the fact that your head is moving, brilliant. Because what it's doing is it's looking for an escape route, because you might fawn or you might freeze, and then you got to figure out, how do I escape this? Or what happens next? And, the brain is constantly trying to work to keep you safe, and that is how it does it. So, when clients come in and they say, well, I feel it here. And then I ask them, what do you feel there? This is the part that gets tricky, because most of the time when we are doing an internal systems check, and you can see it when you watch the episode, one of the things that I think you'll notice is nobody is actually taking the time to say, what do I really feel and where do I feel that? I don't know anybody that does that. Not on a regular basis, and certainly not outside of the therapy room. Why? Because it's just not natural. And because it takes time. Because it's inviting us to actively participate in assessing ourselves. And then the second part of this is we don't have a language for it. So, what do you do? Because if we don't have words for what we feel, and we don't really understand what we feel, Could be anything, which is why I've started to ask people if I can have permission to enter their holodeck and hear what they think. What do they feel? What does it feel like? And one of my favorite things, because I would love to be able to interview the actress that played this role. I would have loved to have been able to do it when she did this, because I think the interesting thing here would be she has to get herself into that mindset in order to be able to portray it. And I'm imagining that they probably did some things to help her. But now think about it like this. The last time that you were scared of something, maybe somebody suddenly pulled out in front of you or something unexpected happened. That's different, isn't it? Yeah, because it's unexpected. But when you've got time and you're sitting down and you're thinking about something and you start to worry, we start to go into some kind of dark places, because in that worry, we start to wonder, what is the threat? And this is, I think, why it is so crucial when you're sitting with your therapist to just say, hey, give me a minute to kind of think this through. And ask yourself, what do I feel? What do I really, truly feel? Because I think you'll be surprised. Even though people point here, often they're also looking at me to see, is that what you want me to do? No, I want you to go where you want to go, not where you think I want you to go. I need you to be focused on you, because you're not there to please me, all right? And that's hard for a lot of people, because our natural inclination is, I want this to go well and I want you to like me, and then I want to walk out of therapy and I want to feel better. Great. So walk with me in this path. This is how we do this. What you do when you think about Sally being confronted by the fact that she's seeing messages written to her by some unknown person, and it's a warning because it's telling her to duck because something's about to come. And it says, no, really, duck. So you can imagine, there's an unknown threat, but she's got a few minutes, maybe seconds, notice that something is coming. So now she's got the start of that flooding of the chemical reaction to threat. Here's what happens next. In that situation, the other thing that she's experiencing is she's trying to get to a place of, how do I get safe? Where do I go? What do I do? What's going to help me to feel safe in this situation? Here's what is really important about this. First of all, what ends up happening is the body and the brain start to go through this whole process, and then we start to think in a particular direction, because our higher functioning, one, is trying to figure out what is going on. Second of all, where am I going with this? What am I doing? Notice it, and I'm kind of, I think, repeating myself an awful lot, but I really want to hammer home the point of why this is so crucial that we spend time getting into the process. Because when I ask people, what do you feel? They can tell me all kinds of things that they think, but rarely can they tell me what they feel. They'll say, I just feel it here. What is it? And this is the part that is the hardest for a client sitting across from me when I'm saying, what does that feel like? So now they're using adverbs, they're using adjectives, and sometimes nouns to describe what it feels like. That's a good start. Now, if I was to ask Sally, what do you feel looking at the words on that wall? I'm imagining, I don't know, because it's going to be different for everybody, but I'm imagining that what she's feeling is confused. How did somebody know that I was going to be here? And why am I ducking? That's where my mind goes, but again, that's my bias. So what hers was, we don't know, because she doesn't tell us. But she does duck, so she trusts it on some level. As the episode progresses, she begins to develop an awareness that the problem is the angels, and that the weeping angels are trying to get to the TARDIS, but they're also trying to get to the key that she has. So the fascinating part of this is that when we think about this, once we've identified what the threat is, we can begin to build a plan to meet it. Now, think about it like this also. And if I'm painting the wrong word picture, somebody put it in the comments, because I'd really like to know your experience. When we have something that feels like it's just outside of our control, or when we feel like we're struggling to understand something that's happening in our world, and we're having that feeling up here in our chest, or maybe we're having it right here, Maybe it's that sensation at the back of our neck that the hairs are standing up on the back of our neck and we can't really explain it. This is the part where we begin to take it apart and look at it and say, okay, because if I can get you to recreate that in the therapy room, we can begin to master that. And then we can begin to look at what's going to help you to feel confident in at least challenging that, to see if there's any real meat and potatoes behind that. And I'll use this as a for instance. I talked with somebody who said, every day I get up and it's the same thing. I'm very afraid. And I ask, what are you very afraid of? I don't know, but I feel it right here. And it's been something that has been around ever since I can remember. Well, then I asked, do you ever remember a time throughout the last week, the last 10 days, maybe even the last 6 months where you didn't have it? Yep. Almost everyone I've ever asked that question to can point to specific periods of time during the day when it is either less or not there at all, which is really important for you to know. Because what is the threat? Well, sometimes we can't identify it. Now, here's another little twist that you didn't see coming. Sometimes we feel the threat inside. Sometimes it's something outside, and we have no way of knowing what that outside is. And I'm going to use that shadow. Wait a minute, right there. That kind of looks like a man. All right, it keeps catching my eye. And see, when I turn my head, I know that it's from the hallway. I have no idea what it is. But from here, looking at it, it kind of looks like a part of a man holding onto a surfboard in my mind. And if I was to get really quiet, my imagination would begin to spin up something to give that context and to make it make sense. But it would also tell a story. But now what I can feel kind of a, almost like a burning sensation in my chest if I think about it. Because what is that? Is it a threat? What kind of a threat is it? And I start asking those kinds of questions. So how's that for an example? But then when I turn around and I look for it, I can't really see it. See how that works? Because it's an existential threat. Is there really a man standing out there? No. Actually, there's a clock on the wall out there that is giving that shape. And what you're seeing is the reflection of that wall with that darker wood clock on a white wall. That's what you're seeing. But can you see, though, how your mind plays tricks on you? And because of the way that it looks on camera, you can see the outline of a man standing there, right? There's nobody out there. So I hope that this helps to kind of understand. And what you're going to see over my face in a couple of different places are the weeping angels and a couple of different things. If you haven't seen the episode, I invite you to look at the episode. But the other thing that I'm going to invite you to look at, there's another video. It's the episode Silence in the Library. And the interesting thing is, I think it's called the Vada Narushta, I think. I might have that wrong. I don't know. It's been a little while since I've seen the episode. But there is a microscopic entity that ends up killing two of the people who are in the episode. And it does it in a way that you're not aware that they've killed the person until you hear, hey, who turned out the lights? So I'll put a picture of that, the before and the after of that guy. But the thing that I most want you to take away from this particular episode is the way that fear can sometimes show up in an unexpected way. And that unexpected way is when we begin to tell ourselves a story around something that we're trying to explain or we're trying to understand. And our inclination is to go to a negative story and it becomes a threat. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who comes to me and says I have anxiety, I'm not saying that they're all telling me that same story, that, there's some kind of a threat and I want to figure it out. More often than not, they're miserable. And if you happen to be one of those people, I can appreciate that in that misery, you really want an answer, but you also want to make it stop. And that's why it becomes so important that when we're in the therapy room, one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to get a sense of what is the connection. Where did I learn this? What is the story that I tell myself around this, and how am I making the meaning? One of the drawbacks of therapy is that I don't have the experience with you from your perspective until you share with me the information around what exactly it is that it means to you. And even then, it still gets filtered through my lens and my bias because, again, I don't have your experience. So I apologize for that. And I don't know any other therapist that is going to be able to specifically understand, because again, human nature is we're going to shape everything through our bias. That's not to say that we aren't going to be helpful. It's to say that sometimes it's a lot harder for us as therapists because our natural inclination is to try to help you and try to give you tools to be able to navigate this. The thing is, you've already got skills. It's just that sometimes they work better than others for you. And sometimes we keep doing the same thing over again, trying to get a different result. Now, I appreciate that often there's also a passivity that says, I just don't want to deal with it. Let me invite you to deal with it. Because the sooner that you deal with it, the more capable you will be of being able to resolve that. And I'm going to use the weeping angels to explain that. Sometimes the difficult part of sitting with something that feels emotionally painful is that we don't distinguish emotional pain from physical pain. We just know that we don't like something. If you think about Brussels sprouts, that's a weird thing to say, Brussels sprouts. Some people really like them. I think they smell like dirty socks. I don't care for them. Now, I have eaten them. Still don't care for them. I don't care how much garlic and Parmesan you put on them. Still not eating them. Okay? But I can't say that they create some type of a response in me. They don't make my gag reflex go. Okay? But what I can tell you, where I was going with that, is everybody has a different experience of the same events. And you've heard me say this before. How we address that, and if we intelligently sit down and recognize that emotional pain is a little bit like eating those Brussels sprouts. Sometimes we hold our nose and we suck it up and we do it. But then we realize, you know what? I did that once. Maybe I'm good. Because I needed to know, and I'm not sure how it happened, and maybe Brussels sprouts was a bad idea. But the first couple of times that I ate Brussels sprouts, I was okay with it. After that, I thought mini cabbages that don't taste like cabbage, done. Had no value for me. Same thing is true of kale. Not really a kale fan. Let me get off of food for a minute and talk about something else. But recognizing that there's a difference between emotional pain, emotional discomfort, and meeting emotional challenges. Now, often what we do is we tell ourselves that something is really horrible and we want to avoid it. That's the worst thing that we can do. And I'm not saying that in every situation we should run headlong into everything that makes us uncomfortable. That can be a problem. We have to exercise some discretion here. But what we do need to do is we need to be aware that the more that we're trying to suppress stuff, ignore, avoid, the more that we're actually building a bigger monster. Now, my business is called Dragon Slayers Anonymous for a reason. Most of the time, we're not slaying dragons if we're sitting in the castle, drinking mead, and telling stories. Okay? You actually got to strap on the blade, and you got to walk out the door. That's the first step. And if you're coming into my office, I applaud you. It takes a lot of courage to walk into a therapist's office and to start to talk about things that are deeply personal and intimate. I've heard things that, even in 25 years of police work, I didn't hear. And I appreciate that people feel that they can walk that journey with me and take me with them. Because some of these things are really horrific experiences. I'm reminded of a young man that I met in San Diego who had come to this country from another country that was in the midst of a war. And talking with him at 18, this is a young man who didn't know any other way of living and thought that everybody grew up this way. His existential fears had nothing to do with watching a scary movie, wondering if a shadow, was a creepy ghost, or a bad guy. Not at all the same. So the context has everything to do with it, but it also shapes how we begin to craft the narrative with self around what is scary, what is not, whether or not I'm going to meet it and deal with it, or I'm not. Now, when I think about, some of the really dangerous things that I intentionally did in the course of my 54 years, I've done some pretty dangerous things that, in retrospect, are probably pretty stupid. But you know what? In the moment, I was anticipating something with glee and with excitement. And the difference there is that when you're anticipating something with glee and excitement, what you're also doing is you're overriding that fear. Yeah, I was up on Long's Peak, and that day there were several people that fell off and died, 14,255 feet in July. And the thing about it is that doesn't make me great or glorious or any of that. But climbing up to the top of that mountain and taking that risk of climbing that mountain on that day with the snow and the ice at the top, it was something that I just felt like I had to do. And it helped me to overcome a significant number of fears. But it also enlivened me. And it was something that when I got to the top, I was just awestruck. Unfortunately, the 14-year-old kid that went up with me looked around and he goes, "That it?" All right, well, before this gets too long, let me go back to the weeping angels. So again, to recap here, the point is, when we are feeling that sensation here and we start to hear negative messages inside of our head and we start to begin to craft a narrative, and then we get stuck in that negative narrative that everything in our world goes wrong, it always goes wrong, it always goes wrong for me. Notice that language. That's really important that we pay attention to that language. Now, Sally Sparrow, to her credit, lost her best friend in one day, in an instant, blink of an eye. Second thing is, she was pursued by entities that were trying to get her, steal her future, without her knowing that that's what they were doing. But also, they were coming after her, specifically. And she had no idea where they were going to be or what the threat really is, even though she'd gone to the police station to say, "I lost my friend," and the police officer also disappears. And, in all of this, I'm inclined to think that the surrealness of the event was overwhelming, and therefore that's why she wasn't able to feel the sadness and the travesty or the full weight of her friend disappearing, the police officer disappearing, and the threats on her life by the angels. Now, there's a certain thing that happens, a come down after a highly charged emotional and traumatic event. The brain goes into kind of a recharge, regroup, and begins to try to navigate that. And then it weaves the story back together again to make it make sense. Even if it's a tragedy that doesn't make sense, it will still try to make it fit a narrative in order to give it space so that we can be able to kind of come down from that and the body can recover so that it's no longer feeling like it's under threat. And then the last thing that you need to know is when you're sitting with a good provider should be asking you about your experience and trying to get to know from your perspective. The therapist should not be leading in this. It should be you. It should be you saying, "I was here, this is what happened, this is what I feel in my body, this is what I felt then, this is how it makes me feel now." And as you're exploring that with that person, they need to be curious. The therapist needs to be curious about this, because the only real way for you to experience true change is if, in that partnership with that therapist or whoever you happen to be with, you begin to challenge that narrative and say, "Okay, what is the threat? What am I really feeling? How do I navigate this?" And one of my favorite things I like to tell people is we need to map the terrain, because we kind of got an idea where we want to go. Now what we got to do is we got to figure out what are the obstacles in the way, and then how do we navigate that. Fair enough? All right, well, this went about 5 minutes longer than I anticipated. Like I said, you're going to see some images from the Weeping Angels that I'm going to be adding to the video to kind of give this a little bit more context. Again, I apologize for this being Tuesday and this coming out instead of Monday. We did just put Mom at a assisted living facility. So that has also changed some things in my timeline and my emotional space. All right, well, as always, if you like this, hit like, share, subscribe, and if you didn't, I'm okay with you leaving a comment too to say that was a waste of 45 minutes. I'm doubting that you got all the way to 45 minutes, though, if you complained. Again, maybe I'll do a video to talk about the excitement and what happens if we pursue too many things that are exciting. Let me know what you think. Talk to you later. This is Kelly, the Kilted Therapist.